I'm Tyra Majors. Let's dive right into the deep end. A man from Indiana will spend the next 4 months in prison for conspiracy to violate the Clean Air Act. That sentencing was handed down in U.S. District Court in Tacoma last week. Jonathan Achtemeier pleaded guilty last November to tampering with the monitoring devices on hundreds of vehicles across the country so the trucks would not detect if their owners removed pollution control hardware systems. Steve is in the ARC Lounge right now with Assistant U.S. Attorney Lauren Watts Staniar to talk more about this case. Steve?
Yeah, Lauren, it's nice to have you with us this morning. And as we were just chatting during the commercial break, it seems like this is kind of an unusual crime in a way, but very lucrative, which is probably part of the reason why he was apparently doing this.
Yeah, so, just like you said, Steve, just like we were chatting, this individual made about $4.3 million over the course of 3 years, essentially helping a broad base of customers, quote unquote, to remove the parts of their diesel trucks that filter the air that we all breathe. It's really an important part of the mechanism of a diesel truck. And what Jonathan Achtemeier was doing is he was going into these trucks, manipulating the computers of the trucks, called an onboard diagnostic device, or we call it an OBD.
Okay.
And that computer is essentially a watchdog. It tells the truck, hey, your emissions are, overboard, you're polluting too much, so something's going on with the truck. And people who want to override or remove these emissions hardware systems, they need to trick that OBD into thinking the systems are still working. So that was Jonathan Achtemeyer's particular talent, is that talent with computers, able to kind of trick those computers in the trucks to think that these systems are still working, when in reality, they had been removed and the trucks were allowed to essentially emit limitless pollution into the air that, again, we all breathe and we all rely on to breathe.
I want to ask you more about the environmental impact in just a moment, but for people who have heard of this act, the Clean Air Act, for people who don't know what that is, explain what that is.
Yeah, so the Clean Air Act is really the overarching federal law that Congress passed in 1970, signed into law by President Nixon, that gives communities the tools to clean up our air.
Okay.
And what Congress did is it looked at kind of two sources of pollution: stationary sources and mobile sources. Stationary sources, that might be a power plant. Mobile sources, that's the things we drive. It's the most common: cars and trucks. And the Clean Air Act empowered the EPA to essentially set limits about what these sources could emit. And what Congress was thinking about when it passed the Clean Air Act, and we know this from the Act itself, is pollution is really harmful to human health. And those health effects are serious. Folks who are exposed to pollution, they have increased risk of cancer, they have increased risk of asthma and respiratory disorders, cardiovascular disorders. Pregnant women who are exposed to air pollution have premature births. And this was something that was hindering our country economically, it was hindering our country health-wise. So Congress and the president at that time said, we really think that this is going to be an economic boon, we think it's going to be a health boon, and it has been. The Clean Air Act is 55 years old. In that time, U.S. GDP has quadrupled, and emissions from air pollution have really significantly reduced. So we would have expected, GDP goes up, pollution goes up, and that hasn't been what happened, and it's because of the Clean Air Act.
That one's now in effect. It may be hard to maybe calculate what the impact was from this Achtemeier case, but do we know what the potential impact was on the environment here locally because of what he did? Yeah,
we do, or we have a sense.
Okay.
What we know is that removing the emissions controls on a diesel truck means that that single truck can emit between 30 and 1,200, is the equivalent of between 30 and 1,200 emissions compliant trucks on the road.
Wow.
So
that's a lot bigger than I think a lot of people would realize.
Right, yeah, and it's, it's a big range too. So we know a little bit more narrowly for like a pickup truck, for example.
Yeah.
A single deleted pickup truck is the equivalent of 340 emissions compliant pickup trucks. And when I'm saying deleted, that might not be a word that your viewers know. That's the kind of nomenclature for a truck, or the slang for a truck where the emissions have been removed.
Okay.
So we say deleted.
Okay.
So it's significant, and you know, Mr. Achtemeier, he admitted to manipulating the computer on hundreds, maybe even thousands of diesel trucks. So when we say hundreds times that 340, you know, it's potentially thousands of trucks that are on our roads in Washington state and around the country harming health.
Do we know how he advertised this or even how he did it? Is it just simply doing it on a computer and that get changed? Is it as easy as that, basically?
It really is, and that was the particular innovation. But let me first talk about how he advertised it. So, you know, this is illegal, and so he didn't go out and advertise in commercials and kind of publicly. It was a little bit more subtle than that. It was word of mouth. It was, you know, Facebook groups, Instagram, kind of targeting these diesel truck owners that might say, gosh, I wonder if this is a good thing for my truck to do. And actually, we heard from some of his customers that, you know, they didn't think it was that big of a deal because the way that Achtemeier was posting about it, kind of in
kind
big,
of dumbing it down, kind of?
Exactly, yeah. And, you know, they said, gosh, I didn't think it was a big deal because he's posting about it on this Facebook group that has thousands of members. And one of the real tools that Achtemeier used was word of mouth. So we heard from, you know, customers of his that they would have problems with their emission system. And so they'd ask a colleague, you know, what do you do? And they'd give this, the colleague would give this number and say, call this guy, this is the go-to guy. And, you know, this customer might not have set out to delete their truck, but when they called Achtemeier, he said, no, this is what you've got to do to deal with these emissions. We will remove it, we'll bypass it, and then I'll manipulate the computer. Now, the customers knew what they were doing was wrong, but it was really Achtemeier that was able to facilitate this.
Really quickly, because we're short on time, what was he ultimately sentenced to?
He was sentenced to 4 months in prison and a $25,000 fine.
Okay, pretty short. Pretty short. Thank you for coming in this morning and explaining this.
Absolutely.
Obviously, it's a case I'm sure that will catch a lot of people by surprise and certainly is something unusual that you don't necessarily hear about with crimes involving that Clean Air Act. So back to you, Tyra. Interesting investigation and more to come, I'm sure.
I mean, you put it perfectly, Steve. Unusual indeed. Yeah, and good job to investigators for cracking that case.
That's right.